The night was alive with the hum of warships in orbit above Earth, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the stars like dark knives. Below, the planet's once thriving cities were now shadows of their former selves, crushed under the boot of the Centaur Empire. The invaders had been relentless, reducing humanity to nothing more than a subject race, their future wiped out before their eyes. Yet in the midst of this chaos, something stirred, a quiet rebellion. Captain Alara Voss, leader of the underground resistance, watched from a safe house in the remains of a former capital city. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 1,000 lost lives. Her reputation among the rebellion was solid. She had once commanded fleets of warships in humanity's last, doomed stand against the Centaur. Now, she led a ragtag group of survivors, her eyes set on an impossible goal: to ignite the flame of revolt against an empire that seemed invincible. Tonight, that flame would be lit. Her plan was simple: strike at the heart of the Centaur supply chain. A convoy carrying critical supplies to one of their forward bases was scheduled to pass through an asteroid field just outside Earth's orbit. The convoy's defenses would be heavy, but not invincible. Ilara had something the Centaur didn't: surprise. And the stolen data she'd managed to smuggle out from a previous mission, a map of weak points in the Empire's war machinery, was the key. Ilara addressed her team, the ones who would make this suicide mission a reality. They were an eclectic bunch: engineers, former soldiers, hackers, and deserters from the Empire itself. The tension was thick in the air as they prepared their gear. If they succeeded, they'd score a significant victory and secure a much-needed weapon. If they failed, Earth would be one step closer to extinction. "Listen up." Ilara's voice was steady but sharp. "We're not just stealing supplies. We're sending a message to the Empire, to every human living under their thumb. We can still fight. We can still win." A chorus of nods and murmurs of agreement filled the room. The crew, though nervous, was determined. They had no choice. Failure wasn't an option. They boarded their modified warship, the Crimson Talon, a once proud vessel now stripped of its luxuries, but armed with enough firepower to level a small city. The stealth shields were their best defense, designed to make them virtually invisible to the Centaur's scanners. But even with the element of surprise, they would be facing overwhelming odds. The convoy was escorted by 2 battlecruisers, their massive guns capable of vaporizing anything in their path. All systems green. "We're good to go," said Kale, their engineer, from the cockpit. "Time to make this count." Ilara took one last look at Earth through the ship's viewport. It looked so peaceful, so far removed from the violence that raged just beyond the atmosphere. It was easy to forget that millions of humans were suffering under the Centaur's rule. She clenched her fists, the fire of rebellion igniting in her chest. For Earth, for humanity, they had to win. The Crimson Talon slipped silently into the asteroid field, using the rocks as cover. The convoy appeared, as predicted, on the edge of the field. 2 massive Centaur warships, flanked by smaller supply vessels, moved in tight formation. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. They couldn't afford to miss their shot. "All systems are go," Kale reported, ready to deploy the disruptors. Ilara nodded sharply. "Let's make history." The Crimson Talon shot forward, emerging from the asteroid field in a deadly burst of speed. The Centaur ships never saw it coming. The first blast from the disruptor hit one of the battlecruiser's dead center, knocking out its shields and sending it spiraling into the path of an asteroid. The Talon weaved through the wreckage, releasing a barrage of missiles that crippled the smaller supply ships. The remaining warship fired back, but the human ship was too fast, too unpredictable. Ilara piloted them through a deadly dance, narrowly avoiding fire while her crew hit their targets with precision. But the cost was steep. The Centaur were not so easily defeated, and their response came swiftly. A sudden surge of enemy fighters shot from the cruiser, surrounding the Crimson Talon. Ilara's heart raced. They had to finish this quickly or be overwhelmed. Kale, divert all power to the aft shields. She commanded, her voice cool despite the rising tension. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're not done yet. A firestorm of weapons clashed in space, the Crimson Talon dodging and weaving like a storm through the night sky. The mission was working, but every second counted. The battle was over, but the cost was high. The Crimson Talon floated among the wreckage of the Centaur convoy, its hull scorched and pocked with damage from the retaliatory fire. The mission had been a success. They'd crippled the convoy, disabled one of the battle cruisers, and secured critical supplies. But they had also drawn the attention of the Centaur Empire's vast war machine. The momentary silence in the cockpit was deafening. Ilara surveyed the damage, her knuckles white on the ship's control panel. The thrill of victory had faded quickly, replaced by the cold realization that this skirmish had just made the rebels a target. The Centaur would come for them, and they would bring everything they had. Kale, check the weapon systems, Ilara ordered, her voice calm but urgent. Make sure we're still operational. We won't get another chance like this. Aye, Captain, Kale replied, his face tense as his fingers flew over the consoles. We're good to go, but we'll need a refuel. The disruptors drained the reserves. Ilara nodded. A quick glance at the remaining fighters, once part of the convoy, showed the scope of the damage. The rebellion had been dealt a blow, but they had struck a decisive one in return. Humanity's fight for survival had just entered a new phase. She turned to the rest of the crew, their faces weary but lit by the same fire that had driven them to this point. It was time to regroup and expand the war. The Crimson Talon was only one ship, and they couldn't afford to waste this victory. Not when the Centaur Empire had so many forces still at its disposal. We have to get back to the safe house and plan our next move. This wasn't just a raid, it's a signal. The Empire thinks they've broken us. It's time we show them how wrong they are. Her words were met with a murmured agreement from the crew. They all knew the stakes. A single victory wasn't enough. The rebellion needed to spread, to show the galaxy that humanity was capable of standing up to the Empire's might. Ilara knew that if they didn't make this moment count, the Centaur would wipe them out in the next week, maybe sooner. Back on Earth, the Resistance's underground cells were on high alert. The message from Ilara's victory had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the planet. Rebel leaders who had once only dreamed of retaliation were now faced with the reality of taking action. Hidden in the depths of old bunkers and abandoned cities, the rebels gathered to discuss what came next. One of the rebel leaders, Kira Mellon, sat at a holographic table, her fingers tapping the surface nervously. Kira was a former fleet commander who had watched the Empire ravage her homeworld. Like Ilara, she had seen the worst of the Centaur's cruelty, but now she wasn't sure what came next. The rebellion needed structure, leadership, something they lacked. They'll come for us, Kira muttered, eyes scanning the map of human resistance cells. The Empire's no fools. They'll retaliate harder than ever. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp voice of Jarek, a former Imperial officer who had defected to the rebellion after a brutal awakening to the Empire's horrors. His experience with their tactics was invaluable, but his mistrust of their leadership caused friction. You're right, Kira, Jarek said, but the key now is expansion. The Crimson Talon's success means the Centaur know humanity's still in the game. We need more ships, more support, or we'll be crushed. More ships? Kira snapped, her frustration evident. We don't have the resources to fight an all-out war. Ilara's team is one ship, one attack. What makes you think we can sustain this? Jarek's eyes narrowed, his tone turning cold. Because I know how the Centaur think. They'll focus on Earth, trying to choke off our support. But they've underestimated humanity's will. I've seen it firsthand. If we can hit them where it hurts, across the galaxy, we can break their grip. Kira hesitated. There was truth in what he said. Humanity's resistance wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. But freedom couldn't be won with a handful of ships. We need more than just a few daring raids, Kira said, her voice firm now. We need an army, and we need to unite every human colony that still exists. In the depths of space, Alara's victory was sending ripples through the galaxy. The rebels were rallying, their ranks swelling as word spread of humanity's first strike against the Empire. But with Xanthor aware of the threat, time was running out. Ilara's next move would determine whether the rebellion would remain a fleeting spark or ignite a fire that would burn across the stars. The success of the convoy strike had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. But as Ilara Voss and her crew returned to Earth, they knew they had barely scratched the surface. The Xanthor Empire's wrath was swift and unforgiving. Reports flooded in of brutal retaliations on human colonies, with entire cities wiped out in a matter of hours. Earth's once thriving colonies were now smoldering graves for those who had dared to defy their oppressors. New Earth, the last independent human colony, was at the center of the storm. Ilara had received word from Kira Mellon, the leader of the resistance on New Earth. The Xanthor were massing their forces for an assault. Word of their first victory had spread like wildfire, and the Empire could no longer afford to let humanity continue to defy them. They were sending everything they had, fleets of warships, legions of battle androids, and orbital bombardment platforms capable of glassing entire continents. New Earth had no chance of withstanding such an attack. But Ilara wasn't about to let that happen. Not on her watch. We have to get to New Earth, now, Ilara said, pacing the Crimson Talon's command deck, her voice sharp with determination. We can't afford to wait for reinforcements. The resistance there is our last stronghold. If we lose New Earth, we lose everything. Captain, Kale spoke up, his eyes glued to the tactical display. The Xanthor are already in orbit. They've begun the bombardment. We're looking at full-scale planetary annihilation within hours. Ilara's fists clenched, her anger barely contained. Then we'll give them hell. The Crimson Talon shot into hyperspace, racing toward New Earth at impossible speeds. As they emerged from the jump, the sight before them was a nightmare come to life. A massive Xanthor fleet, a mix of dreadnoughts and battlecruisers, hovered above the planet like vultures ready to descend. New Earth was already in flames. The planet's defense grid was a pale shadow of its former self, overwhelmed by the sheer might of the Xanthor assault. Fires raged across the surface, casting long shadows across the cities as the Empire's orbital bombardment platforms unleashed hell. Ilara felt a pang of grief in her chest as she watched the planet she had fought to protect burn, but there was no time for mourning. They had a job to do, and it had to be done fast. The Crimson Talon was one ship against a fleet, but they had no choice but to take the fight to the Xanthor. We're going in hot, Ilara ordered, her voice unwavering. Kale, patch us into the local resistance channels. We need eyes on the ground. Within moments, a voice crackled over the comms. Kira Mellon, breathless and grim. Ilara, I didn't think you'd make it in time. The city's defenses are shattered, and we're surrounded. The Xanthor have begun deploying their ground forces. They're already landing their troops and sweeping through the cities. They're targeting the resistance fighters first. We're not abandoning you, Ilara replied, her voice full of fire. We're coming in. Prepare your fighters. We'll make a diversion while you get your people to safety. Understood, Kira's voice was hard, but tinged with relief. Just make sure you can make it out. We're losing ground fast. Ilara's heart beat in her chest like a drum. Time was running out. The plan was simple: create enough chaos to draw the Xanthor's attention away from the resistance, give them a window to regroup, and then launch a counterattack. It was a high-risk operation, but it was their only chance. As the Crimson Talon approached New Earth's atmosphere, Ilara gave the order to launch the strike. The ship's weapon systems hummed to life, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as they powered up the disruptors. "All systems are go," Kale called from the cockpit. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. This is going to get ugly." The Crimson Talon descended through the atmosphere, dodging flak from the Empire's anti-air defenses, and unleashed a barrage of missiles at the Centaur's ground assault forces. The explosion shook the air, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. As the ship swooped down low, Ilara's tactical display lit up with incoming enemy fighters. The Centaur had anticipated their move and were already mobilizing their aerial forces. A dogfight ensued, the sky above New Earth erupting in a deadly dance of laser fire, missiles, and exploding fighters. Ilara's hands flew across the controls, weaving through the flak and enemy fighters with a deadly grace. Each shot she fired hit its mark, sending Centaur fighters spiraling into the atmosphere. On the ground, the Resistance began their counteroffensive, using the distraction to regroup and strike back. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed up through the city's streets as Kira's forces launched guerrilla attacks against the Centaur ground troops. But the Centaur weren't backing down. A new wave of assault ships broke through the atmosphere, descending upon the city like a storm. Ilara knew they couldn't hold the line for much longer. "We need to get out of here before they call in reinforcements," Kale shouted from the cockpit. Ilara's gaze flickered to the tactical map. They had drawn the Centaur's attention, but now they had to escape before the Empire's full fury was unleashed. "One more pass," Ilara said, gritting her teeth. "We hit them hard, then we're gone." With a final devastating strike, the Crimson Talon fired its last remaining disruptor, crippling one of the Centaur's dreadnoughts. The Centaur fleet recoiled in chaos, buying the Resistance just enough time to escape. Ilara exhaled sharply, her pulse racing. They had done it, they had survived. But the battle for New Earth was far from over. The Crimson Talon soared back into space, its hull scorched and battered from the harrowing battle above New Earth. Ilara Voss sat in the command chair, her eyes fixed on the view of the planet they had just fought to defend. The Resistance on the ground was still reeling from the Centaur onslaught, but thanks to their diversion, they had bought enough time to evacuate key fighters and civilians. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The Centaur's retaliation was inevitable, and it would be brutal. "We can't keep running." Cal's voice cut through the silence, his tone heavy with exhaustion. "We're playing with fire, Ilara. Every move we make puts more targets on Earth's back. The Empire's not going to let us keep slipping away." Ilara didn't need to look at him to understand the weight of his words. She had seen the same devastation, the same destruction. But she had also seen something else, hope. Humanity hadn't folded under the Centaur's might. They had fought back, and they weren't about to stop now. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But we can't just sit back and wait for the Empire to come knocking again. We've got to take the fight to them, hit them where it hurts." Kale turned to the tactical display. The Centaur fleet is regrouping. They've already begun reassigning units to crush any pockets of resistance on the outer colonies. If we don't act fast, there won't be anything left to save. The gravity of their situation weighed heavily on the crew. They had just survived one of the most harrowing battles of the rebellion, but the Empire's wrath would not subside. They needed more allies, more resources, and above all, a plan that would tip the balance of power. Ilara made her decision. "We need to find a way to hit their homeworld. We cripple their supply lines, and we force their hand. The Empire's strength comes from its unrelenting control over the galaxy's resources. If we can disrupt that, we can break them." Kale looked at her incredulously. "Their homeworld? That's suicide, Ilara. Even with the Crimson Talon, we're not getting close to their capital. You're talking about the heart of the Empire. They'll wipe us off the map before we even get close." Ilara stood up, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We've already proven we can hit them where it counts. The Xanthor's arrogance is their weakness. They think they've crushed humanity, but they don't understand what they're up against. Her gaze swept across the crew. They had come together from all walks of life: soldiers, engineers, deserters, civilians, each of them carrying the weight of their own losses. But they all shared one thing in common. They were survivors, and they were ready to fight for a future. "We don't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore," Ilara continued. "We're not just fighting to survive. We're fighting to take back what's ours, and that means hitting the Empire where they least expect it. We need a plan, a big one." As Ilara spoke, the crew members began to gather around her, their skepticism slowly giving way to determination. The war had only just begun, and they were ready to make their mark. Meanwhile, back on New Earth, the rebellion's underground cells were reeling from the damage inflicted by the Xanthor's retaliatory strike. Kira Malin stood in the ruins of a former resistance base, surveying the aftermath of the battle. They had managed to save many, but the losses were staggering. The streets were littered with the remnants of war: burned-out vehicles, shattered buildings, and the still smoldering remains of fallen comrades. Kira's mind was consumed with the hard decisions that lay ahead. The Xanthor would not relent. If they were to have any hope of winning this war, they needed to unite the scattered factions of humanity's resistance. It was the only way to stand a chance against the overwhelming might of the Empire. She activated her holocom and reached out to the various resistance leaders across the colonies. "We've all seen what the Xanthor are capable of," she said, her voice resolute. "But we've also seen that they can be beaten. We cannot allow ourselves to be divided any longer. It's time to unite our forces. We need to take the fight to the heart of the Empire itself. If we strike at their supply lines, we can cripple them. If we strike at their capital, we can destroy their will to fight." The response was overwhelming. A wave of messages flooded her comms. Some were filled with hesitation, others with disbelief, but all shared one thing in common: a willingness to fight. For the first time in years, the scattered human resistance was coming together. As the Crimson Talon sped toward the coordinates of their next mission, Ilara stared out at the vast expanse of space. The battle for New Earth had been a small victory in a war that was far from over, but it had proven something important: humanity wasn't finished, and the Xanthor would soon learn the cost of underestimating them. "This is just the beginning," Ilara muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "We will burn their empire to the ground." And with that, the Crimson Talon disappeared into the void, the next phase of the rebellion already in motion. The Crimson Talon streaked through the dark expanse of space, its engines pulsing in steady rhythm as it made its way toward the Empire's most heavily guarded system. Ilara Voss stared at the stars outside the viewports, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and doubts. They were about to strike at the core of the Xanthor Empire, their central supply hub, and the risks were greater than ever. Failure would mean the extinction of the human race. But if they succeeded, they could cripple the Empire's war effort for good. "You know, Captain," Kale said from his station at the helm, his voice laced with a bit of humor despite the gravity of their mission, "I've always wanted to go out with a bang. I just didn't expect it to be this big." Ilara allowed herself a brief smile, but it quickly faded as she turned her attention to the tactical display. The Empire's supply hub was located in the heart of a heavily protected system, its defenses stronger than anything they had faced so far. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate, disable the supply chains, and get out before the Empire could retaliate. In practice, it was a suicide mission. "We've already made it this far," Ilara replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "We won't turn back now. We hit them hard, take out their supply lines, and cripple their ability to wage war. This is how we end it." Kale nodded but said nothing, his fingers dancing across the console. The tension in the air was palpable. The crew had grown closer over the past few months, but the stakes had never been higher. Every member of the Crimson Talon understood the risks. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a fight for the future of humanity. As they neared the system, Alara's gaze shifted to the other members of the crew. Each of them was focused, steely-eyed, and prepared for what was to come. They had all lost something: family, friends, homes during the Empire's brutal expansion. The loss had shaped them, hardened them, but it had also united them in a way that no enemy could break. "I've been running the numbers," said Cassia, the ship's engineer, breaking the silence. "We're going to need to be in and out fast. The Xenthor aren't just going to let us waltz in. They've got enough firepower to turn this whole system into a graveyard before we even get close." "How much time do we have?" Alara asked, her voice steady, though her mind raced with calculations. "Maybe 30 minutes before they notice us. If we're lucky," Cassia answered, her fingers tapping the interface in rapid succession. "It's going to be a race against the clock. Once they send a signal out, we'll have half the fleet on our tail." "We're going to make it," Alara said firmly, turning to face the crew. "We've beaten impossible odds before, and we will again. The Xenthor will never see us coming." Back on New Earth, Kira Malin was organizing the next phase of the rebellion's counteroffensive. The united forces of humanity's scattered resistance cells were coming together in ways Kira had never thought possible. The message from Alara had inspired more than just hope. It had ignited a fire in every human fighter who had heard it. For the first time, the rebellion was more than just a series of isolated cells. They were a unified force, bound together by a singular goal: the destruction of the Xenthor Empire. Kira paced back and forth in the war room, surrounded by her commanders and intelligence officers. The holographic map of the galaxy flickered before her, showing the locations of various resistance groups, as well as the major targets they were preparing to strike. "I don't need to tell you how important this next phase is," Kira began, her voice carrying the weight of their cause. "Alara and the Crimson Talon are taking the fight to the heart of the Empire. We're going to keep the pressure on the outer colonies and distract them, buying time for the Talon to complete its mission." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. The resistance was still reeling from the previous attack, but there was no turning back now. Every move had to count. "We need to make sure the Xenthor don't have time to recover," Kira continued. "Hit their infrastructure, disrupt their supply routes, and keep them off balance. They think we're a ragtag band of rebels. Let's prove them wrong." One of the commanders, a seasoned fighter named Talon, stepped forward. "We've got a network of underground fighters who are ready. If the Crimson Talon can disrupt their primary supply line, we can cut them off from their key sectors. It won't be easy, but we've got the will to do it." Kira nodded. "Exactly. This war is about more than just winning battles. It's about striking at the heart of their empire. We have to make them bleed." As the Crimson Talon entered the Xenthor system, the enormity of the task ahead loomed larger. The central hub was a massive space station, surrounded by a labyrinth of defense platforms and heavily armed ships. The station was the lifeblood of the Empire's war effort, its supply chains running through its veins like the pulse of a beating heart. The Talon would have to slip through the defenses unnoticed, disable the station's central operations, and escape before the Empire could mobilize. It was a tight window, but one Alara was willing to take. "We've got one shot at this," Alara said, her voice steady but intense. "We don't back down. Not now, not ever." She turned toward the view of the central station looming ahead, its silhouette bathed in the light of nearby stars. "Let's bring the fight to them." And with that, the Crimson Talon dove into the heart of the storm. The Crimson Talon glided through the darkened expanse of the Xenthor system, its hull barely a whisper against the void. Alara Voss stood at the helm, her hands steady on the controls as the ship neared the massive space station that served as the lifeblood of the Empire's supply network. The plan was simple: get in, disable the station's core systems, and get out before the Xenthor could retaliate. But as she gazed at the station looming ahead, its sharp edges cutting through the stars like a predator, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a mission, it was a gamble that could change the course of the war. "We're almost in position," Kel's voice crackled through the comms. "Shielding is holding steady. We'll have a clear path in a few minutes." Alara nodded, her eyes narrowing in focus. "Keep it quiet, Kel. No signals, no trace. The Xenthor are already on edge. One slip-up, and we're dead." "We're ghosts," Kel replied with a grin. "No one's going to see us coming." Cassia's voice joined in, her tone sharp with anticipation. "I've bypassed their external sensor grid. We should have a clear entry through the blind spot on their lower side. Once we're inside, I'll take control of their internal systems, but you'll need to disable their primary power core before we can make our escape. It won't be easy, but it'll give us the advantage we need." Ilara's eyes flicked to the tactical readout. The station was a fortress in every sense of the word. Its defensive grids were a layered web of energy shields and automated turrets designed to repel any intruders. But Cassia's expertise had allowed them to slip through the outer defenses undetected. If they were lucky, they might just pull this off. "Once we're inside, we'll have to split up," Ilara said, her voice steady as the crew prepared for the next phase. "Kel, you and Cassia secure the power core. I'll handle the rest, disable their communications, cut off their reinforcements. We can't let them call for backup." "You got it, Captain," Kel said, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by quiet determination. "Let's do this." As they approached the station, Ilara's pulse quickened. They were about to penetrate the heart of the Xenthor Empire, and there was no turning back. The station's hull grew larger, its intricate architecture looming like an ancient fortress. The silence of space was deafening, the only sound the low hum of the Crimson Talon's engines. With a jolt, the Crimson Talon entered the station's atmosphere, passing through a maze of shadowed docking ports and defensive shields. They slipped through the blind spot Cassia had identified, and the station's exterior lights dimmed as the ship glided into the shadows of the massive docking bay. Inside, Cassia said, her voice a whisper of triumph, "I've locked down their internal systems. We have 5 minutes before they realize we're here." Ilara nodded sharply. "Let's move." They entered the station's dark corridors, the silence punctuated only by the soft clank of boots against metal. Ilara led the way, her blaster at the ready. The station was eerily quiet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But she pushed the thought aside. The fate of humanity was riding on this mission, and they couldn't afford hesitation. As they moved deeper into the station, they encountered the first signs of resistance. A group of Xenthor guards, heavily armored and armed with pulse rifles, appeared around a corner. Ilara's heart raced, but her training kicked in instinctively. She dropped to a crouch, her blaster firing with pinpoint accuracy. The first guard fell with a silent thud, the others hesitating for only a moment before returning fire. Kel and Cassia flanked Ilara, their weapons joining the chorus of gunfire. Ilara moved with precision, her team working in perfect sync. In seconds, the guards were down, their bodies sprawled across the cold metal floor. But they weren't going to have much time. The Xenthor would already be scrambling to understand what was happening. "Keep moving," Ilara ordered, her voice cutting through the tense air. "We're almost there." They reached the heart of the station, an immense chamber housing the power core that fueled the entire facility. It was a massive, glowing orb, suspended in a web of energy conduits. Cassia immediately set to work on the control panel, her fingers flying across the interface as she hacked into the core's security systems. 10 seconds, Cassia muttered, sweat beading on her brow. "This won't be pretty. Once I trigger the shutdown, we'll lose the whole system. They'll come at us with everything they've got." "Do it," Ilara said, her voice unshaken. We can't wait any longer. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. But as the final seconds ticked down, an alarm blared through the station, its shrill cry cutting through the air. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Too late, Kale growled. They've already called for reinforcements. With a flash of light, the core erupted in a blinding burst of energy, sending shockwaves through the station. The walls trembled, and the lights flickered. The Crimson Talon crew had done it. They had crippled the station, but now they had to escape. Move, now, Ilara shouted. As the station's power grid began to fail, the crew sprinted for the exit. The Xanthor were coming, and there was no time to waste. They had delivered a devastating blow, but now the real fight was about to begin. The Crimson Talon raced away from the crumbling station, its engines roaring as the massive power core they had sabotaged continued to destabilize. The station's walls groaned and creaked, the sound of imminent collapse echoing through the ship's hull. Ilara Voss gritted her teeth, her eyes locked on the stars ahead, willing the ship to go faster. The mission had been a success. They had crippled the Empire's supply hub, but at a great cost. The station was falling apart, and the Empire would soon send its entire fleet to wipe them out. Shields are holding, but we're taking fire, Kale called out from the helm, his voice tense but controlled. We've got at least 2 Xanthor cruisers moving in to intercept. They're coming in fast. We need to outrun them. Ilara snapped, her mind racing through options. Cassia, can you get us an escape route? Cassia was already at her station, her fingers flying across the controls as she scanned the chaotic energy readings from the station. I'm working on it, she replied, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. There's a graviton rift up ahead. If we can make it there in one piece, it'll take us through a subspace anomaly. We'll lose them in the rift, but it's risky. The gravitational flux could tear the ship apart if we're not careful. How long do we have before they open fire? Ilara asked, her voice tight with urgency. Not long, Kale answered. Those cruisers are getting closer. They've locked onto us. The Crimson Talon shuddered as a blast from the nearest cruiser struck its rear shields. The entire ship jolted, throwing the crew off balance for a moment. Ilara gripped the armrest of her chair, her eyes narrowing in determination. Ready the rift jumped, she commanded. We take it, or we don't make it out of here. Cassia didn't hesitate. On it. She tapped a few final commands into the system, her fingers trembling just slightly as the ship's FTL drive powered up. If we're going to do this, we need to make the jump on my mark. Ilara glanced at the tactical display. The 2 Xanthor cruisers were closing in, their weapons primed. They had moments, maybe seconds, before the Empire's fleet would open fire with everything they had. A single direct hit could tear the Crimson Talon apart. We do this together, Ilara said, her voice low but resolute. She looked around at her crew, each of them tense but ready. We can't stop now. The ship lurched again as another blast from the cruiser rattled their shields. The rift was just ahead, an unstable black hole that, if navigated correctly, could propel them into an alternate dimension of space-time where they could slip away undetected. If they could reach it, they could escape. But if they miscalculated even slightly, the rift could consume them. Mark, Cassia said, her voice clipped. Now. The Crimson Talon shot forward, its engines screaming as it surged toward the gravitational anomaly. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure of the accelerating speed. The rift loomed, a swirling mass of black and violet, its edges crackling with unstable energy. The cruisers were closing in, laser blasts lighting up the space around them. With a final burst of speed, Ilara pushed the Talon into the rift. The ship bucked violently as the rift's pull began to drag them in, the stars outside warping and distorting as they entered the anomaly's field. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring as the structure of the ship strained under the gravitational forces. Ilara clenched the controls, her knuckles white. Hold on. she yelled as the ship was yanked forward, the universe around them twisting into a kaleidoscope of light and darkness. For a heart-stopping moment, it felt as if the Crimson Talon was going to be torn apart. Every inch of the ship felt as though it was being pulled in every direction, the very fabric of space-time stretching. The crew was tossed around inside, the ship rattling and shaking as it was pulled deeper into the rift. Then, with a deafening crash, the ship shot through the rift's center. The distortion ended abruptly, and the Crimson Talon was thrown into a new region of space, a quiet, desolate expanse far from the Xenthor fleet. Status report. Alara barked as she fought to regain control of the ship. The view outside the viewport revealed nothing but swirling black space, the stars distant and cold. Shields are at 50%, Kale reported, his voice strained but relieved. Engines are holding. We've lost the Xenthor. They're nowhere near us. Cassia let out a sigh of relief. We made it. We're safe, for now. Alara leaned back in her chair, her breath coming in short bursts as the adrenaline began to subside. They had done it. Against all odds, they had escaped the Empire's grasp, but their journey was far from over. They had crippled the Xenthor's supply chain, but now they had to deal with the consequences of their actions, and they were coming. The Xenthor would be furious. Their wrath would be unrelenting. Prepare for the next phase, Alara said quietly, her voice hardening once again. We've only just begun. As the Crimson Talon drifted through the unknown reaches of space, Alara looked out at the stars. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The true test of humanity's strength was just beginning. The Crimson Talon drifted through the void, its engines dimmed to conserve power. The crew sat in silence, each of them deep in thought, reflecting on the victory they had just achieved, and the inevitable storm that was about to hit. Alara Voss stood at the helm, her hands resting lightly on the controls, her gaze fixed on the black expanse outside. They had broken the Empire's supply line, dealt a devastating blow to their war machine, but now the Xenthor would be hunting them with relentless fury. We can't just sit here, Kale said, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned back in his seat, the weariness of the past few days heavy in his eyes. The Empire will be tracking us. They'll send everything they have after us. We need a plan. Alara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. We need to regroup, Kale. We've taken a hit, but we're still alive. That's more than some of the others can say. Cassia's voice came through the comms next, her tone urgent. The rift we used has thrown us off the grid. We've lost any Xenthor tracking signals, but we're in uncharted space. No way to know what's out there. We need to find a safe zone, something we can use to lay low, refuel, and plan our next move. I've been thinking about that. Kira Mellon's voice suddenly came through, coming from the surface of New Earth where the bulk of the human resistance had rallied. Her image flickered to life in the holographic console. We've received reports from other cells. The Talon's success has inspired more uprisings. The Xenthor are stretched thin. We might have a chance to unite the scattered resistance forces. That's good, Kira, Alara replied, her voice determined, though it was clear the strain of the mission was starting to show. But we can't just sit on our laurels. If the Empire is going to come at us, we need to hit them harder, faster. Kira nodded in agreement. We need to go on the offensive, force them to divide their resources, make them react to us instead of the other way around. We've gained momentum, Alara. Let's use it. Agreed, Alara said, taking a deep breath. We'll rendezvous with the nearest resistance cell. After that, we need to hit their forward command posts, disrupt, sabotage, and keep them guessing. We can't let them regroup. Kale grinned, though there was little mirth in it. A bit of chaos, eh? I like it. Cassia's fingers flew over the console. I've locked in coordinates to the nearest outpost. It's a risky jump, but we'll be able to access their intel and resupply there. If we can secure it, we might have the edge we need. Ilara's mind worked quickly. They were operating on borrowed time, and every decision could mean life or death, not just for her crew, but for every human still under the heel of the Empire. If they failed, the galaxy would fall. If they succeeded, it could be the turning point of the war. "Prepare for the jump," Ilara ordered. "We'll meet up with the cell, get the supplies, and move out. No delays." The crew went to work, every movement efficient and practiced. The Crimson Talon would be the spark that ignited the galaxy into full-scale rebellion. The Xenthor had thought themselves invincible, untouchable. They had underestimated humanity's will to survive, and now they were going to pay the price. As the ship powered up for the next jump, Ilara stood at the front of the bridge, staring at the distant fading stars. The battle was far from over. It had only just begun, and this time humanity would not retreat. The ship's engines roared to life once more, surging through the void as they entered the unknown, ready for whatever came next. The Empire had shattered their worlds, their homes, their families, but it was the humans who would break the Empire itself. "You hear that, Xenthor?" Ilara muttered under her breath, her voice cold with determination. "This is only the beginning." As the Crimson Talon vanished into the depths of space, the spark of rebellion burned brighter than ever. The final reckoning had come, and humanity would stand strong.